Good afternoon, colleagues. It's so lovely to be back after a short break. I hope the winter has been kind to you, and hopefully spring is going to get going here in the UK. Thanks for joining us today. I have the greatest of pleasure of welcoming today two colleagues from the University of Gloucestershire. Susie Atherton, Dr Susie Atherton, and Dr Omar Masri. Susie is the MSc leader in criminology at Gloucestershire University, and her research interests broadly explore alternatives for justice provisions. And Dr. Omar Masri, sorry, Omar, is interested in researching the sociology of post-conflict. It's really interesting that Susie and Omar have come together to look particularly at art within carceral and post-conflict spaces, and look at the sort of transformative effects and the implications and impact of that today. What I want to encourage our viewers today is to post comments and questions to Susie and Omar, and hopefully after the presentations we will hear their thoughts and responses to your questions. So sit back and enjoy the show. Thanks for coming again. Susie, Omar, are you there? Hello.
Hi.
Hello. Thank you for coming. Over to you guys. And I'll see you after your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Knight, for introducing us. I think, am I doing it? Yes, excellent. So you're all very welcome. My name is Dr. Omar Masri, and I'm joined here by Dr. Susie Atherton from the University of Gloucestershire. And this is our exploratory study into reflecting on our own research, my research looking at street art in post-conflict environments, and Susie's research of working around the arts and transforming social worlds of prisoners in carceral spaces. And carceral here we mean specifically prisons, or at least the setting of the prison. And in my context, in cities or spaces that emerge from conflict, as in Beirut and Belfast. And so what we thought today we would do is I would introduce our topics, and really this is actually reflective of shared interest that Susie and I have about elevating discussions of art and culture as an analytical framework to explore environments that have had environments against all the odds, effectively. So prison spaces and cities that are emerging from conflict, oftentimes violent conflict, and then the effect of people, or the effect that those kinds of control has on people. And so we decided at the very beginning that art is a signifier of transformation and change. When art is being produced by people, something happens that is quite remarkable. It's where people come together, and through learning about how to draw, how to paint, how to use a spray can, how to, the difference or logistics to put a piece of art on the wall, what happens in that temporary moment. And that's something that we wanted to kind of encapsulate. And we thought that doing this presentation together, and of course, would be quite beneficial for our own research, but also to help further develop this field of what happens when we create art together, especially in environments that might be restrictive in the prison setting, a controlled environment, and in these environments that I'll be reflecting on in a moment. And of course, the research conducted by Susie was conducted with Professor Knight with Soft Touch Arts Leicester. And then she'll reflect on that, of course, during her presentation. Something to always kind of remark on, as we'll be talking about our presentation, and I've probably already noticed, I've already started kind of making the comparison. So seeing that we're looking at elevating discussions of art and culture at the intersection of social, and in my case, political transformation, there are a lot of concepts that we can see traveling between our different cases, different themes, if you will, this idea of concepts that travel. And so the settings of which we're looking at are very controlled settings. The prison setting is controlled, of course, by, or informed perhaps by, government policy around prisons, but also different sort of environments and different sort of kind of institutions that, take a prisoner and, and of course, because of being a prisoner, certain kind of rights being removed or revoked, but then also within that space, can something else emerge that might help transform this person rather than just serving time? And quite similarly, in post-conflict environments, there are a lot of control. For example, when conflict happens, and something that we can reflect on quite actively with human rights approaches to looking at the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, the ongoing Palestinian, the ongoing Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territories, the direct impact of lived experiences on people in those environments and how they choose to make meaning of life. And so sometimes we see little glimmers of hope that kind of emerge from that as, something that we're interested in exploring. So fundamentally, a clear theme that kind of travels between both of our studies is how people make meaning of their experiences, really with the arts. So, using a symbolic interactionist kind of idea, concept, and of course the meaning not only between the people themselves, but also the facilitators, those that are either researchers or, in our cases, directly involving ourselves with the production of these pieces of artwork that we'll be reflecting on during today's presentation, and as well as the observers, those who are passing by, citizens, urban dwellers, but in the case of the carceral environment, not only the people themselves, the prisoners, but also the different people that work within the prison. So what is happening in this moment to everyone around them when these pieces of art are created, and of course here against all odds. So I suppose introducing my idea, my topic, there was actually a slide I think that was missing. Bear with me. I think there was a missing slide. Forgive me for that. There was an image that I had before this. And if you can imagine, essentially it's a blank wall and in Arabic, and it was during the Lebanese uprising in 2019 against government kind of crackdown on social services. The wall said, "Why is this wall clean?" The idea is that the city walls have always kind of informed us of ideas and meanings and stuff. But the conceptual framework that I want to present to you today is fundamentally something that I think about is, how do we start thinking about street art or mural art in environments that are recovered from conflict? Specifically, when I think of street art, I think of it as a portmanteau of two words, street and art. And so in order for me to understand how does art help transform people's lives, I have to contextualize in the context within is the street. And so here the street is, there are certain kind of frameworks that I can kind of frame it. One idea is Lefebvre's right to the city. This is a French urban sociologist from the 1960s who was commenting of the student protests, in fact, the global protests that were taking place in the 1960s, late 1960s, across the world in response to the continuous decolonization of the former colonies, in response to social services being removed from public spaces, and of course students taking part in large-scale demonstrations demanding all these different types of social services. So the idea is to kind of think about how do we remake the city with the goal of creating a more just and ideal society, and that's really engages with these kind of disciplines of urban studies and urban design. But what makes it quite fascinating in terms of framework, it also suggests that there's a level of agency that can be given, or rather that can be taken by an individual. And so space is a practice place. Space here, I don't necessarily mean like an abstract concept in our mind, space as in like the universe, but space literally as being a site, a physical location whereby different people is a site of social struggle, essentially, for different groups of people that trying to make sense of this space. Essentially, one can imagine sitting outside of City Hall in your respective towns and seeing a series of benches. Those benches were created for the purpose of allowing people to sit, perhaps to reflect on the beauty of the city hall or the gardenscapes around them, but that might be perceived as a way for people to sit on, perhaps a meeting space, perhaps a place to kind of temporarily sit, wait for your friend or your partner, and then go and give someone else that space. But then other people might use that bench for other purposes. For example, they might use it to sleep on it. They may use it to terms of meeting, perhaps as a place for them to practice their own cultural identity. And here we can think about young youths, for example. I like the youth who engage in who like listening to like goth music and such dress as such, or different subcultures and stuff. And so the idea of lived spaces, how people actively live in those spaces, which is very different from the way they were conceived. In the context of my research, I looked at two cases, street art in both the cities of Belfast in Northern Ireland, which is predominantly in Western Europe, surrounded by different democratic states that for the most part are quite stable, and that has gone through a period of peace negotiations. In fact, it's the 25th year anniversary of the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, which called an end for the sectarian conflict taking place between the Irish and the Catholic populations that sided with the United Ireland, and the Protestant populations that sided with to remain part of the United Kingdom. And so effectively, these different ethnic groups are vying for control with diverging national aspirations. And then compounded with the state's need to maintain some form of legitimacy after the conflict ended by the international community, engaging in these kind of neoliberal ideas. And neoliberal is just neo being new, liberal ideas of, minimal state intervention, letting the economy, letting the economy set up policies around development. And this is also really important because after conflict ends, the social fabric of society has been ripped apart. The sense of conviviality that might bring people together beforehand over certain kind of shared ideas and cultures, think sports, think food, think all these different things, is completely obliterated after the conflict ends. And so then who's responsible for matters of social cohesion and national reconciliation? And so in both instances, we find that actually those things did not happen. And so what is street art? And also giving the context, I wanted to add the idea of what is street art to kind of further problematize these environments. It's a global phenomenon which took place since the 1990s, emerged. It's mainly of mural depictions on city surfaces, city walls. Each mural has an author or authors, usually working together. They're assigned with the author's kind of username, a combination of letters that they find meaning through. It's linked to their own individual, social, cultural, or their own ideas, their own perspectives of society or things that are matter to them. The style is they usually use a spray can or sometimes roller paints, and it can either be affixed to a wall using stencils, a grid, and some instances a freehand. The location is quite site specific in that wherever you see a piece of art in that moment on a particular location, it's a result of a kind of a collaboration of people. And also most mural pieces take elements of the city surfaces and parts of their pieces. And I'll show you how those are in a moment. But there's always respect for the built environment, fundamentally because people live there as well. And the content of these murals typically are either retrospectives of pre-existing works, memories, dreams, or really the whims of the artists themselves. And so within all of these different environments, what is street art actively trying to do? Who are these artists? What are their intentions? Are they trying to accommodate for the lack of social cohesion that, or the imperfect national reconciliation? And so this is really where, our research kind of comes into play. Are we looking at arts and culture? I mean, we are looking at arts and culture as a way to analyze these things. But what we're finding is that, in fact, they are different than, perhaps billboards or advertisements trying to sell you something, trying to encourage you to buy something, or posters telling you who to vote for, or in some cases, places that you're allowed to come into, places where you don't feel safe to go to, and so we think about, are these strategies effectively to pacify people, to say this is a place that you can enter, there's a shopping center, only certain people that can come here are those who are able to obviously afford, you can't linger here, so just not anyone. So there are all these spaces have certain kind of rules and stuff, and so yes. And so I thought I would kind of start you off just to kind of give you a sense of street art. This is actually a very famous piece of work that was created around 2008, and this is a neighborhood in West Berlin called Kreuzberg. For those who have visited Germany over the last, probably the last 10 years, and so these artists, Blue and he's an Italian artist, and JR, a French artist, came together to this particular location in parts of the cities that are, in fact, Berlin at the time was going through a lot of economic regeneration and redevelopment, where big parts of the city were being redeveloped after the Cold War ended. And of course, one way, but for many people that were, left, many people that didn't have housing, or as a result of the unification of Germany and some parts of the land being taken away by the government for development, many people ended up being homeless, or rather, or were at risk at homelessness. And so there's this kind of informal way of moving back and forth. But then also artists and other people that couldn't afford the skyrocketing rent in these new urban areas within Berlin migrated to these areas that are, in our perhaps our imagination might be darkened or don't look like anyone lives there, but the reality is people do live there, and they do make it their own spaces. And so these artists, Blue and JR, and this is quite common within the street art worlds, that street artists like to convert spaces into what they consider free, accessible, open air art galleries. And so the top left image you see there is the image that was first created, a combination of different elements as a way to kind of entertain and to kind of give to the communities. But then quite common, what we find within cities that are redeveloping or regenerating, is that we sometimes find property developers finding these areas whereby people are, there's more footfall coming in, or rather these areas are now being clean, they're being sanitized. I'm using air quotes here deliberately, suggesting that no one lived there. This kind of bizarre colonial kind of hangover, if you will, of going to areas and seeing that if it doesn't look like it's used, therefore it isn't, but in reality it was. And so developers came in and tried developing the location. The moment that they did, the artists, as you can see, the top right and the bottom left image, blacked out their piece in protest of this gentrification, or this possible gentrification of the neighborhood. And so in 2008, rather than 2014, they blacked out the image entirely to de-beautify the built environment, as a way to kind of say that this regeneration that was coming in was going to destroy the meaning of this place to so many different types of social worlds that have used this space outside of the way that these developers want to use it. And most likely the developers that will want to use it will only allow certain types of people to live there, i.e. people who can afford to live in these kind of developed areas. And so there's this really interesting moment that took place whereby they blacked it out, as you can see. And then finally here at the bottom right, you'll see an image of a finger with the middle finger really kind of suggesting something to developers, saying that, we're going to black out this image and stuff. And so I thought I would take you on a quick whistle-stop tour on some of the street art from both cities, just to kind of get a sense of how this all manifests. So the artist in this piece here by Romy Motad is a 21-year-old graphic designer from the Lebanon, and currently living in London, but is a stencil artist by in addition to her day job. So she creates an image here of an astronaut with a speech bubble returning to Earth, explicating his dismay with the continued degradation of the natural environment in Lebanon and the waste management. And in fact, that culminated in the 2015 garbage crisis, which saw the streets of many Lebanese cities littered with uncollected trash and, in fact, garbage. And in fact, we see similar images of that in Paris recently, with the anti anti-Macron protests against the increase of the age of retirement in Paris. And so while the location of the artwork took place amid these fiery debates of the changing nature of the once sleepy neighborhood where this piece of art was created, when I asked the artist what did they think about that, they actually said, well, that's not what the intention of the piece was. She didn't mind it. She could have said that she could have put the astronaut anywhere else in Beirut, but because given the circumstance and the conversations that were taking place, people derived meaning from it. And then as a result of that, started copying this image and using it within their protests as well. So regardless of whether the artist intended on creating some form of change, a change did occur, which in of itself is quite useful. But the artist, unlike, didn't seem to mind, and in fact was unbothered by it. She just, wished that people would have given more attention to some details when they're reproducing images. But for the most part, this was quite interesting. The second artist here, Z40, created this mural on the side of a road in a very important thoroughway leaving Beirut, and it's a thoroughway that is notoriously stuck with traffic, cars back to back, single occupancy vehicles, and such, and he wanted to kind of poke fun of this idea of us being stuck in traffic, and with like the beeping of the horns, which is quite common in Beirut and similar Mediterranean cultures. And so instead of painting cars stuck in traffic, he essentially orchestrates the maestro orchestrates the sounds with the use of a colorful image of a maestro conducting music to the soundscape of honking cars commuting their way out of the city. And the artist suggests that the content of the work was as though they were conducting the cars stuck in traffic while hoping it would animate discussions for people around, for example, the single occupancy vehicles or the pollution, or whether the idea of working from 9 to 5, is that really sustainable? All these different conversations were being had in this moment. And so when I asked the artist, he said it was a maestro conducting music with the notes as though he was attempting to synchronize the beats as well. So here it becomes something a bit more beautiful in a sense, like that we are all part of this orchestra of beeping sounds, which sometimes can be melodic if it all teams up well. While in Northern Ireland, many of these artists will employ the wall to fit their piece. In fact, this artist here produces this galaxy, this fox jumping over what is effectively a door, and a door has a metal grate and a sign inside that says "Beware of guard dogs," and the all ubiquitous camera surveilling all of our movements. And so these are all different parts of the street furniture that kind of designate that this is a place that people can't go to. You literally can't walk in there, and even if you did, there was a threat of a guard dog and a camera and stuff. And so here the artist creates a fox jumping over the overing the door entirely. And if you can see, there are two exhaust pipes that she uses to create the eyes. And so she says that this is this fox called Galaxypos, in fact, is where we all want to live, but we're currently stuck and we can't move forward. So she created this piece as a way to kind of engage in those conversations. So the respect for the built environment is, again, a very important principle which many artists are taught in higher education, or at least within their schoolings during the A levels as well. And so this is it is very specifically site specific. Finally, home taping is killing music. This is by an artist known as Kevlargi. And he depicts the evolution of music and the social norms as a place of contention, but also communicates it as a total reaction to the environment as well. And so his piece is a 4-story high work, which was created for the Red Bull Music Academy, which took place in Belfast. So many of these artists will create pieces for a festival or for an event, in which case they're always given some sort of monies to create the work, given spray cans. Other artists do it from their own, they do it from their own pocket, and this was actually sanctioned. And so it shows a boy sitting serenely on a speaker, listening with headphones to a single reel tape player plugged into a flue on the side of the building. On his knitted hat is the logo of the British Phonographs Industries 1980 campaign against home taping. I guess rather cassette taping. For many of us from the 80s and 90s, we will remember that that's how we used to communicate music, cassette taping. But then, of course, with the rise of the cassette, it also put an impact on the phonographic industry, especially the ones who were creating music, and there was a conflict there in terms of that. The specific depiction is a commentary on music and history of hip hop artists who recorded this very famous break. It's called the Amen break, which is a drum loop of 17 seconds. The Amen break spurred a genre of music which incorporated drum and bass, hip hop, and breakbeat, which is something that we also, for many of us that liked British music during the 80s and 90s, were very much part of that moment. And he said that it's the most heavily sampled loop on the planet. And as opposed to limiting it to certain groups of people, he said that, in fact, that this is actually it's a satire of this existentialist narrative that we have, of which music is actually against sampling from other music genres, which we know is actually not true. Reggae might have gotten influence, or drum and bass, or rather house music might have gotten influence from reggae, hip hop influence, rap. And so it's this ongoing thing, which makes music far more vibrant and more durable as well. So, by shedding light on some of these artistic practices, I found that the street art communities engage in these kind of social engagement of gifting, where they still their self-identification as artists are still very important, but they view themselves less as artists and more as people trying to speak to these changes, these changes that are taking place amid the legacy of sectarianism in their both respective environments. But they talk about this kind of convivial interactions, again, these symbolic interactions with the city and between inhabitants, which they hope will enchant the passersby. And so the idea of gifting, this unidirectional gifting, takes place, which is quite different from the idea of, I'm going to sell you something and you're going to buy it. So it's a different interaction that's taking place. Another interaction which is quite useful is that they engage in something that's called small p politics. They're non-confrontational and they're non-traditional. So they're kind of seeking their own environment, their own space, where is based on pragmatism of places that they can paint and they don't paint, rule-based in certain environments. Women in many of our cities across the UK, Reclaim the Night, for example, and other kind of feminist discussions of city space and use. We know that women's experiences at nighttime is very different from women's experiences during the daytime, and that also applies with women street artists, who are women, and then of course street artists who then paint in collective. So there's a level of pragmatism that takes place when it comes to producing art. Another thing as well is that it's a democratic form. In fact, when we're elevating discussions about arts and culture, a form of democratic forms of placemaking occur on the street level, which are both transient and transformative for the people participating in the creation of the work, the passersby, and those who contribute to it either financially or by giving it a wall. And now I'm going to turn over to Susie.
Thank you very much, Omar. Right, let me just get okay. So I'm going to pick up on some of the themes Omar's talked about there, as art as a particular form of transformation, but actually apply it now to the prison and also the community setting through an arts project. This is all based on work that actually Vic Knight at De Montfort Uni did with Benedict Carpenter Van Barthold at Nottingham Trent Uni undertook. I kind of came in to help with writing the things up and actually producing some outputs from it. And that's really kind of our intention today as well, is to actually use this as a way to generate perhaps some more outputs. And we think there's some very important themes that are coming out of both our areas of interest and research that require certainly some outputs and perhaps even also further research. So the arts-based workshops I'm looking at are called Potential Unlocked. They operate both in prisons and the community, with the idea to engage prisoners and re-entering citizens with creative learning. The lead artists that work at Soft Touch Arts are facilitators for learning, and that's a very important part of the ethos. So similarly to the relationships that Omar's explored into how the art's actually produced, we are talking about co-production. Public exhibitions, again, are a very important feature. And so again, a bit like the kind of process of gifting, it's something that is put on for close friends, family to come and see. There's not a charge for it. It's not about selling. It's just about showing it and displaying it. And again, I think it's a very important feature for those involved to know that their work can be appreciated by others. So the discussion today is based on that research, and particularly based on the work of the artists. And also, because the theme of this kind of series is about hope, this research was done and it was conducted in the Chime framework, and two very important elements of that, which we're kind of picking up on here today, are hope and optimism, but also meaning in life and empowerment in spaces and places and settings where there are challenges to that. And like Omar said, that this meaning and this empowerment occurs against the odds, very much so. So these are just a couple of examples of the artist's work that I picked out just to show the detail, the level of creativity, the freedom of expression that the artists, were able to have. That they weren't tied down to doing simple observational art or given things that they must do. They were allowed that creative freedom to do what they wanted to do. And also, I think what you can see from this image is different kind of media used in the production of art. So this sort of relatively straightforward pencil kind of drawing on the right, but on the left there's clearly somebody who's engaged with all different types of materials. And again, that was a very, very clear feature of the Soft Touch art workshops, is that they would have a whole range of things people could use. So similar to the production of street art with spray cans, with paint, with stencils, whatever, artists wouldn't be held back by what was available. They were given all sorts of different opportunities. And again, that was cited to be a very important element of the work that they wanted to do. So first of all, let's look at the setting. So as with post-conflict societies, prisons are a very kind of specific type of setting that because of the regime, because of the lack of autonomy, the control and the social controls imposed every day, this affects prisoners' ability to make personal choices, to have any kind of opportunity for freedom of expression in any other way. And so presents a challenge, presents barriers to this. Snyder et al. Referred to this as goal interference, simply because prisoners in that setting, with their lack of autonomy, with their lack of control over their situation, is going to impact on their sense of hope for the future, and disrupts their life course trajectory. So whatever plans someone may have had, the deprivations that they experience in prison and the disruption is bound to affect those trajectories. War also refers to a deprivation of certitude, so kind of building on Sykes' deprivations, where prisoners cannot clearly see a path out of prison or understand how to navigate life outside. And in order to enable that and give prisoners hope and empowerment that they can actually think about doing that, art workshops can actually, to some degree at least, to help prisoners overcome that sense of uncertainty about their future. And actually, in the case of some of the artists that were spoken to, they actually express where they're able to think about having a future, to think about what they could do next. And so all these accounts of prison are important to remember when we look at the impact of creative learning in the arts, particularly. So we're talking really about a challenge here, and the challenge is creating hope for those in prison in a setting where social control dominates, for people who are easily othered, disregarded as worthy of being given a chance to change. So much like the symbolic interactionism that Omar talked about, this work can also think about the relationships that occur between staff and prisoners, between prisoners and each other, but also between prisoners who now regard themselves as artists and have been given that title within those workshops. So will start to see themselves in a very different way. It's also important to remember the challenge means overcoming the fact that many prisoners, while they are not high-risk offenders, they've already experienced multiple forms of social exclusion, present complex needs, and it's important that any kind of rehabilitative efforts acknowledge and can seek to overcome this. And again, that's perhaps some of the limitations of rehabilitation programs is it focuses on and depends on individual motivation to change, when actually what we know about desistance literature is it requires more than that. That motivation to change is needed. There also needs to be external conditions that can enable that change. So Sampson and Lau refer to this as the hook for change, or the institutional turning point that something like an arts workshop can provide, but actually much more is needed in order for desistance to be sustained. So the key feature about soft touch arts in this context is that it's a third sector delivering services without judgment. It's needs-based and it works with prisoners, and in fact is very keen to stop calling them prisoners and refer to them as artists as soon as they join the workshops. So they start that process of desistance and change of self-identity immediately. Hope, as we know, is the theme for this series, and it is an important mechanism for change and transformation. As Omar said, in post-conflict societies, hope is required for people to see a way to manage what's happened to them, to see a way out, to see a way forward. And it's a similar thing, a mechanism for prisoners, for them to actually see a different future for themselves. It needs sustained positive reinforcements, particularly when you are in a setting that doesn't provide that ordinarily. Prison is a place characterised by loss and deprivations. Cheliotis and Jordanska refer to this process of capturing secondary desistance, so changes in the perceptions of self that can disrupt or transform somebody from their criminal past. So really understanding what changes can lead to meaningful and sustainable transformation, what change or perhaps lack of change disrupts that and means that that prisoners kind of stay stuck in their criminal past and aren't able to move on. I think it's also important to note here that we do need to look at measures which aren't necessarily immediately quantifiable, that are not hard outcomes that we can see, oh yes, that shows effectiveness. And actually, I think that's a very important part of this research, not only that it was participatory, but also that it actually did capture experiences of secondary desistance, and also looking at, as Stickley and Hugh there said, looking at the disruptive and harmful effect of prison, and therefore then allowing prisoners to deal with that, but also what transferable skills could they develop as a result of engaging in arts. So Johnson looked at this in America, a whole wealth of evidence that shows the benefits, but also some challenges which persist today in terms of the organisational culture of prisons, a punitive ideology, particularly that we see in our political leadership at the moment, leading to a censorship of creative activity. And again, what we've seen from street art, from the art produced within prison settings in these workshops, is that the benefits of this are that you allow creative learning to occur. Other projects have also looked at the benefits of music. So Wilson et al. Looked at a project called Good Vibrations, which has used gamelan percussion music, which is a relatively straightforward type of music to learn. The instruments are just placed in a room, and people can go in and they can just start playing with them and just make a noise. What actually then happens through the classes is that they have to work together, they have to listen to each other, they have to wait their turn, and compose something that then works towards a public concert. So when this was done within the prison setting, it was found that it improved relationships between prisoners themselves. It also improved relationships with staff, They would also find that prisoners would engage with other forms of education because they learned the value of learning something, and decreased levels of self-reported anger. Now, this is an example of actually quite quantifiable outcomes that have come out of something like this. Again, picking up on something that Omar mentioned about agency, and this was again where we saw a parallel between our work, how important that is. Having choice and agency over what you do day to day and what you engage in. And for prisoners who, being referred to as artists, gave them that agency to consider themselves as somebody who could now engage in creative expression, and they were put in a safe space where they could do that, where they had all the materials available to do that. And for many of them, this was a novel activity. This was something completely new, because they could engage in things like, obviously, painting, sculpture, but also things like digital art, which, was something they would never have done at school. For Hakim et al., this provides an additional sense of purpose and meaning, which is important. And again, to counteract that sense of deprivation of certitude and deprivation of having agency and control, that's, I think, a very important aspect to this. So essentially then what happened with these creative spaces and these creative kind of expressions and activities was a confidence boost. Hope was something that prisoners could identify as a way of engaging in self-care. They could see the therapeutic and nourishing aspects of creative activity. And in fact, they would then continue that on release in the community. For some, they actually worked and continued to work in the field of arts. Others used it to springboard to other careers because they'd had that sense of, I can actually do this. I can go and do something else. My life isn't about engaging in that revolving door of prison. The management of emotions for artists was also important, as was found in the Good Vibrations research. Not just in terms of how they manage life in prison, but actually, again, how they manage life outside. Because shifting from their criminal past required them to see outside and the community perhaps as a different space, perhaps as a space which would allow them to change and would allow them to move on. And also planning ahead. And assistance theories would tell us how important that is. So it's about art really signalizing that change, being that signifier for transformation, increasing well-being, focusing on the future. That's crucial then to that transformation occurring, starting at that point of engaging in an arts workshop or whatever it is, and sustaining that to a variety of personal and practical destinations that can occur. So to sum up, we think that there's some very important themes in both our kind of areas of research to look at the presence of agency, the importance of co-production and positive interaction. Omar's particularly looking at this from a social and political dimension, and the production of street art, particularly in the deeply divided cities of Beirut and Belfast, an artist expressing that experience of everyday life. Where art could create unity, where there was conflict, and it's very important as well that the art is a representation of those experiences, whether of a conflict or whether of change or unity, whatever it is they want to express. And in HMP Leicester, where this work could have took place, hope was the key mechanism for transformation, and the representations of the arts, again, an example of co-production, would show that. Some of the pictures would actually show that prisoners thinking about their future, thinking about what's happened to them and how they can change their lives, but also creating something that people could enjoy. So that kind of visceral enjoyment and experience of creating and producing in arts in various forms in both settings was very important. It's also an opportunity for very different social worlds to me, and that's something that occurred to both of us. Art in these places was bringing people together that perhaps wouldn't normally come together. And so we think that's another area that we can perhaps develop for further exploration. And we're talking about experiences that both residents of post-conflict societies and prisoners can use art to deal with trauma, high levels of social control and othering. So really then, just to finish up now, we have plans for publications, findings based on those themes. Perhaps also to look at the different methodologies we use, or I should say that Victoria Knight and Ben Carpenter van Barthold used. Perhaps even to think about further research in these areas, but with the core theme of art as transformation on both individuals and societies. And in terms of methodology, to think about the immersive and inclusive approaches that I think are so important to make participants part of the process, to really understand what we're getting at is lived experiences.
Thank you both for a very interesting journey into both of your research, and I'm really struck by, I think, looking at both of your projects and how similar, some of the themes as you've helpfully pointed out. I'll go to some of the comments that we've had posted. We've had a comment from Di Turgoose. It's not really a question. Loving Omar's image, and I would add the prison image as well. The Beirut conductor, for example, I could see working anywhere in terms of stimulating discussion regarding meaning. And I think it's really struck me as well what you were both saying about meaning. And I was pleased that she's attended today. I've got a question to both of you, and I think it relates to your analysis around meaning that both of you have helpfully pointed out. That for me, what I was thinking was that, can we look at art or visual imagery created by, people within certain contexts without understanding the context? It's almost impossible. What are your thoughts on that?
That's a great question. I mean, that's something that I recommend to my doctoral, my master's students to consider. Like, do you want to go for it?
You started. So
I have to go for it. So the great Stuart Hall from Birmingham said that in order to that representations are individual representations, they're our own perspectives. So in fact, that we automatically start thinking about the piece of work through our own interpretation of it.
Yeah.
And then Gillian Rose, who wrote a great book on visual methodology, kind of extends that and develops a framework that is obviously her own framework, but the idea of how to critically analyze images to reflect on the few things, because we're social creatures, we're social beings. I mean, we don't exist in a vacuum. We're products of history, of movements, of moments, of stuff like that. So all of that stuff that is currently downloaded into our brains that help us see the world in different perspectives. I mean, sociologically, politically, chronologically, historically, etc., influence what we see stuff. And we think of that in terms of visuality, how we go about and actually see the visual, seeing the image itself. But for us to fully appreciate what this moment is, and that's what our research I think is quite useful in this regard, is that we've explored the producer. So the person taking the photo, us taking the photo, the reflexivity of that, the artists themselves, what their intention is, and then people themselves who are the audience perception to it. So it's this, it's a really fantastic analytical framework to understand that. So the reality is, and then that's where the agency comes in as well, because we do have agency. We just don't think that we have agency because we think that the world is too big for us to change, when reality in these environments, the production of arts is actually a result of different people coming together and creating something.
Yeah.
Cool.
But also I think it's important to think about that in the context of the relationship between the artists and who's actually viewing the art, because I think a very important aspect is the public exhibition, and that they actually wanted feedback on their work, and they wanted people to know about life in prison, how they're feeling, what they're thinking about their future. And so having that opportunity to interact with people actually viewing their art and explain, this is what happens to us in prison, this is what, why I've expressed this. I think that's very important and very valuable to people viewing the art as well. And it's about art that's kind of done with prisoners, but also by prisoners. And that co-production relationship, I think, was a very important thing from your work that you did, Vic.
Yeah, and the links to hope then. I'm thinking about your work as well, Omar, and hope. Did any of the artists make comments about hope for a better, the images in Berlin, and you talked about how perhaps is deprived the right word, the deprived area in Berlin, and were there any mentions that there are either protest or giving hope, and how that marries to perhaps some of the analysis that Susie did around self-care and therapeutic, a way of coping with life in that environment?
What's really, I think, beautiful and powerful about our research is that we ask, and that's something that we find to be quite a gap in research written about these ideas of how do we conceptualize hope, how do we understand it. And so something that we both did is, I think, by producing our research, we're able to democratize the different voices of people. And from the artists that I interviewed are around 20 plus, and I still have working relationship with even more. So I have a lovely network of artists. Every time you speak to a street artist, the passion that comes out in their voice is literally it might not necessarily be the word hope, perhaps, but it's like, hey, I want to interrupt you. Stop looking at your phone. Hey, look at this. And I think it's introducing a new way of engagement that is very different, perhaps, than what we imagine it is today. So if we were to take hope and conceptualize it for the purpose of the seminar as a paradigm shift, as something that is that is able to facilitate conversation on the environment, rights, all these different things, then what we do, we're seeing elements of it, specifically how the artists themselves, be them prisoners or people that are, graphic designers, illustrators, or just a random person with a spray can that wants to say something. I think absolutely, yeah.
And what you said about rejecting the sort of neoliberal model that both of these projects or areas of research kind of push against, that it's not about consumerism in that model. Some more questions from Di. Thanks, Di. Question for you, Susie, around sort of pedagogy and for both of you, how some of this can actually feed into criminology programs. Where does could you talk about your experience, Susie?
Yeah, I mean, at the moment in our programs, it very much is a bit of a cursory mention. It's that is included in a module on justice and punishment and prisons and punishment. But absolutely, I think there is scope to develop that and to think about the process of arts as co-production, as creativity, and the impact of that in a whole different range of settings that we can look at. Actually, I don't have any advice or tips or tricks, Di, because what I'd love to do is some more research to develop some, ways of actually trying to incorporate that more successfully in crim programs, and particularly, I think, to involve our colleagues who work in the arts within the university setting as well.
Yeah. So what about in arts programs rather than criminology programs? The dialogue is
that actually there needs to be definitely there needs to be something a bit more sort of two-way, of that we get involved in their work and vice versa. Omar actually has been doing that at the university, looking at visual arts around street art around Cheltenham, and has done quite a lot of work with other kind of disciplines to introduce students to the what visual images can actually represent.
There's a burgeoning field within criminology, which I'm of course, in addition to cultural criminology that we understand, but that is in response to a structure. Instead, there's a burgeoning field. It's more methodological, but also conceptual and theoretical in terms of visual criminology, which I think could potentially create a lovely base to have these conversations. And something that we really believe in is that what we're doing, essentially all we're doing is we're trying to say, okay, well, let's look at the arts rather than as resources, as tools, as the means to an end. Let's look at art and what arts can do, and because the necessary having to come together and creating something, like there's a necessity in order to create art, literally coming together and creating art. It could be temporal, it could be like going to the shop to buy the piece, having a conversation with someone. All these kind of manifest, and I think that that's something that it's quite beautiful that happens. The production of art does not happen in a vacuum. It literally is a result of a lot of people and stuff.
Yes.
Pedagogies that exist. I mean, besides Paulo Freire's critical pedagogy.
Thanks, Di.
Thanks, Di.
Yeah.
I don't want to go into, but yes, there's a lot. But yes, we're keen on exploring them.
Yeah, excellent. I know a topic that Susie and I explored with Ben around this notion of social prescription. Again, probably a neoliberalist idea of using arts as a way of correcting, treating, people. And you talked about, there was that one image that was, I think, a form of protest, the image of a person with the tape.
The
how that was commissioned.
Yes.
Or as part of a wider
Absolutely.
active project. I'm just interested in, are there differences in street art that is commissioned? We certainly have a huge project in Leicester called Bring the Paint, where we see street art being commissioned as part of urban, you mentioned gentrification, how visually attractive. Is that something that you've picked up on, Omar, around?
Absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of literature, very useful literature written by people within urban studies, but also visual studies as well, who talk about the co-option of art, rather art being used as a resource to lubricate economic development. So the logics of neoliberalism when it comes to capital accumulation is not, it doesn't only extend to the physical manifestations of malls, shopping centers, houses, but could also look into disciplines as well. So literally using arts. In Cheltenham, where for colleagues, please do come visit us. Is known as a town festival. We have a series of festivals that take place around literature, arts, food, music, that happen over a quick weekend. There's really no legacy to them. There's no benefit beyond those who can actually afford to come to get on a bus to come into town. For those who don't have easy access to town and stuff, those aren't. So we're seeing more and more of it. And really arts and culture, in terms of we also see it as well, it's not only does it help to lubricate economic development, but it's a really quick and easy way to get people to vote for you again. So if you're a city management official that's running up for election, and you're worried that you haven't met the different demands that you've told your constituents you were going to do, fear not. You can set up a museum or a temporary art exhibition, and people would like that. And it's this really messed up way of thinking, okay, these are the conversations where I think we can agree that public arts, education, the environment should be considered as public goods. The fact that they're not being treated as public goods allows for these kind of interesting, really problematic relationships we have with them, so that arts and culture are things that are sanctioned, if you will, by the state or by city management. And what we're seeing here is the reverse. We're seeing people saying, no, we want to do our own thing. And so it's really that. I mean, it's in those conversations. But yes, I would ask colleagues to resist the urge of looking at art as just a way to kind of lubricate economic development, but say that should not work. But it does benefit the artists, because funded also our society, or with our current government and previous governments as well, we only fund 1% of our budget to the arts. In fact, the Arts Council of Northern Ireland runs on a £1 million budget that is meant to finance the Metropolitan Arts Museum, Arts Centre, the MAC, and the Black Box, and other cultural centres in Northern Ireland, specifically those ones that are trying to engage in transformation and social reconciliation, and natural, etc. So it's also that as well, that many artists have to work, and sometimes the best way for them to work is when the government or the city council hands out these grants to create these festivals. So again, you know, it's really important to be mindful of grander things that are taking place before, you know, but absolutely everything you said. Yep.
I think we've got to stop here. We've got one final point from Jackie around rights to their art, certainly in public or treatment. We haven't got time, I'm afraid, Jackie, to drill down, but I think that links to your point, doesn't it, Omar? And I know that in our experience of the arts project in prisons that these kinds of issues were discussed. But I think it links to your points, Omar, explicitly there. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you for having us.
Your time and effort and thoughts, and lots of nice comments. Thanking you all. I'm so glad you brought this together for us, and good luck with moving forward. Are you happy for people to reach out to you to extend the conversation on this space? Brilliant. Thanks everyone for attending. I don't know about you, but my stomach's saying it's lunchtime. Thanks very much, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much.